Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation on how to engage effectively with Métis communities and governments. My name is Curtis Boyer, and I am the Research Chair in Métis Governance and Policy and Assistant Professor at JSGS. I'm very much pleased to welcome you all today. I'll be serving as your moderator. So the Johnson Scherheimer Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS, is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We are a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan, and that are based actually in the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that is really at the heart of what defines the province. And since the inception of the school in 2007, it's swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. At this time, I'd also like to acknowledge that while today's event is going to be taking place obviously online, JSGS's physical homes are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. For those of you new to the EDI Discussion Series here at JSGS, I'm pleased to welcome you all today. The series focuses on engaging current and future public servants on issues pertaining to equity, diversity, inclusion in the public sector. The series is proudly supported by the Max Bell Foundation, who encouraged the development of forward-looking innovations that impact public policies and practices. And if you'd like more information on the Max Bell Foundation, what they do, and their work, please click on the link that has been put in the chat. Thank you, Karen. So today we have an exciting discussion. It's going to focus on the crucial and important aspects of engaging effectively with Métis communities and governments, as well as how we can aim to foster more inclusive and respectful interactions. Our two expert panelists will provide context for, I think, a better understanding of Métis autonomy and leadership, as well as guide us in building equitable partnerships and meaningful collaborations that are mutually beneficial. Before we begin, however, a bit of logistics about the format of today's event, which is that, following the speakers' introductions, I'm going to pose some questions to the panelists that I think will help us dig into these broader issues. And I think this will give you, the audience, some time to come up with some questions for today, because as following the discussion that we'll be having with the panelists, we'll open up to some Q&A. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Zoom chat function. You can send your questions to me as a message in that Zoom chat, and I'll be able to forward those on to the panelists. So feel free to submit those questions anytime during the event today. And any questions about the logistics or technical issues that occur during the event, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen Yasser-LaForge via the Zoom chat, or her email is at jsgs.events@uregina.ca, and you'll be able to find Karen's contact information in the chat. All right, now that the logistics are out of the way, I'm very happy and pleased to introduce you to today's two speakers. So first up, we have Dorothy Mayo, who is the Deputy Chief Self-Government of Métis Nation Saskatchewan's Inter-Nation Relations Office. Dorothy was raised in the Saulteaux First Nation, situated adjacent to Jackfish Lake near North Battleford, Saskatchewan. She has served in senior executive capacities with numerous Indigenous organizations, institutions, and governments, provincially as well as nationally. And today she'll be representing the work she does with the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. In addition to having earned her Bachelor of Social Work, Dorothy has earned her Master's in Public Administration at the University of Regina in the year 2010. Dorothy brings extensive experience from her work in legislative development, policy, and research with Indigenous governments that assist the Métis Nation in her current role in building that capacity jurisdiction, as well as protecting Métis culture, language, and institutional development. So a tremendous amount of experience there. And Dorothy, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate that. Moving on to our second panelist, Daniel. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Daniel Voth, who is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Daniel served also as a director for the International Indigenous Studies Program from 2019 to 2022. He is a Red River Métis and holds citizenship from the Métis Nation, Alberta. Raised in Winnipeg, Daniel earned his PhD from the University of British Columbia in 2015, and his research agenda focuses on the political relationships between Indigenous peoples, particularly in southern Manitoba and the prairies, as well as the way settler-imposed power structures and land dispositions undermine important gender orientations towards governance. His research has been published in the Canadian Journal of Political Science, the University of Toronto's Law Journal, Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal, Canadian Journal of Urban Research, and several, including several book chapters as well. So, Daniel, wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. I'm now happy to begin our first phase here, and please to turn the floor over to these lines of questions here. And I'd like to begin with Daniel, if I may, and in effort to provide a basic background for our folks and also a courtesy for many of our international guests today. Can you tell us who the Métis are?
Yeah, I'll do that in like at every Canadian Western university. There's like 50 courses on this, so I'm going to distill this into like a very sort of like 2 minutes or less sort of breakdown. There's been this interesting development in the way we think about Métis people, where we've shifted away from very race-oriented understandings of identity towards more political and sociological understandings in the way that most peoples understand themselves. So there's this emergence in Western Canada of a political collectivity that starts to express itself as a group in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and then continues on to today. There's a couple of like moments that I think are really important for the formation of that peoplehood discourse. So people might be familiar with the buffalo hunting brigades in the 19th century. Métis people were very central developers of highly sophisticated systems of governing and laws that were designed to encourage success during the hunting of buffalo in Indian country, or like bison if you're like phenotypic, like you're describing them like biologically correctly. So those buffalo hunting brigades are really important markers of interconnected families and a larger sort of political sense of groupness, of political collectivity. There's also, in that same era, which is we often describe as pre-state, so this is before Canada kind of exists in the West, in the way that we kind of think about it today, there's a ton of political organizing that happens, that comes with, and this is the stuff that I'm super interested in, that comes with also political theory, that Métis people start expressing themselves and having internal debates about what does it look like to live a good Métis life. And a variety of different families have different perspectives on this. It becomes like a very rich marker of political collectivity. In addition, after Canada arrives, one of the eras that we talk about is this era of survival through land dispossession after the state sort of asserts itself. So Métis people get dispersed, often quite violently, and there's a series of resistance movements that occur, both right at the moment that Canada kind of asserts itself in the West in Manitoba, but then also in 1885. So there's also political as well as military conflict with the incoming state that becomes quite a significant marker of Métis peoplehoodness and like collectivity. One of the other things that I think is super interesting, also immediately sort of as the the 19th century or the 20th century gets going, is the rise of new political organizations that are tasked with like confronting new challenges. The world has changed. The buffalo are gone. We need new ways of confronting our challenges. So in Saskatchewan, very famously, the Métis Association of Saskatchewan in the 30s, as well as the Métis Society of Saskatchewan, gets going. In Alberta, there we have Métis settlements that start being organized in the 30s. In Winnipeg, I know we got some folks from my home community of Winnipeg. So the Indian Métis Conference was organized by what is now the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg. That was a big political driver. Manitoba Métis Federation is formed in 1967. The Métis National Council emerges in the early 80s. And all of these new political organizations are designed to respond to the changed world. Also, they capture really well that Métis people continue to exist and they continue to organize. And then the final sort of era is, I think, this two-part of legal challenges. Métis people start hiring lawyers and litigating concerns over the disbursements of their rights from the 19th century. So that's the Manitoba Métis Federation versus Canada case. But also identity questions get litigated in cases like Powley and in the Daniels case. We're also in this new kind of contemporary era of Métis people organizing through memorandums of understanding with provincial and federal governments, and sort of new understandings of the way we can think about self-government for Métis people. So I think that sort of like is the arc. All of what's held together there is held together by, I think, a collective political identity that we don't always agree, but there is sort of a shared sense of history, language, culture, politics, law and family that binds all of us together across time. So maybe does that helpful? Does that work, Kurt?
Super helpful. Thank you, Dan. I think it's so important that the point that you made both early on about the transition from an ethnic group or a racial category to the idea of a nationhood and a political collectivity, as you call it. And thank you also for that great historical overview of the political development of the governance structure. And I think that leads nicely into the question I have for Dorothy. And that is, Dorothy, I'm wondering, like, as a representative of a Métis government here in this province, can you give us and the audience a bit of a background on the structure of what that governance system looks like today, both within in this province of Saskatchewan as well as across the homeland, and following from that, how has that relationship of that governance system been built, and how has that evolved into a new relationship with the federal government of Canada?
Okay, thank you. Kakio Tatamskat Nawao. I greet everyone, and I also want to acknowledge that my office is located on Treaty 6 territory, and also the heartland of the Métis Nation. So just want to make sure that I pay respect to the First Nations and the Métis of this place, and that to reaffirm our relationship with one another. So Egwan Mioasan, that part is good. So yes, where do I start? It's I guess I'll start by saying that the Métis people constitute really a distinct Aboriginal nation, largely based in Western Canada, and that the Métis Nation grounds its assertion of Aboriginal nationhood on well-recognized international principles, including, as Danielle mentioned, a shared history, a common culture, and that culture involves song, dance, dress, national symbols, etc. Of course, a unique language, Michif, with various regional dialects, extensive kinship connections from Ontario westward, a distinct way of life, a traditional territory, and a collective consciousness. The definition of Métis, as adopted by the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, is in quotation, and this is in our constitution: a person who self-identifies as Métis, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, is distinct from other Aboriginal peoples, and is accepted by the Métis Nation, unquote. So directly embedded in our constitution, our MNS constitution. So MNS represents the political, legal, and social and economic interests of Métis people in Saskatchewan. And we undertake bilateral and tripartite processes with Canada and with Indigenous people and other levels of governments as part of our ongoing work to address many important issues. MNS acts to protect and preserve Métis history, promote and develop Métis culture, ensure Métis rights are understood and protected, and helps coordinate and facilitate local activities of Métis communities. The Métis government in Saskatchewan is the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, a democratically elected leadership that is a political voice of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan for well over 60,000 self-identifying Métis and over 30,000 registered Métis citizens in Saskatchewan. The enumeration of citizens of the Métis have just started when I say just started, I mean at least 10 years or more, maybe 15, but more again in the last 7-8 years. We've really solidified our process for enumeration. And it's an ongoing process, and the numbers of the Métis have continued to increase particularly, I think, in the last 5 years. As well, the Métis are relatively a young population with a median age of 31, based on our 2011 census. The Métis Nation includes 12 regions distinctively represented through the Provincial Métis Council. Within these regions, there are up to 125 locals throughout Saskatchewan that are part of the government of the Métis Nation. So, Métis Nation Saskatchewan represents Métis citizens living in Saskatchewan. As such, the Métis Nation strives for the political, legal, and constitutional recognition and guarantee of the rights of people, including the right to land and resource-based self-government and self-government institutions. MNS exists in part to represent and work for Métis people in their quest for equitable socioeconomic development within the province of Saskatchewan. This includes, but not limited to, advocating on behalf of Métis citizens, entering into bilateral and trilateral agreements with Canada and Saskatchewan, including partnerships on mutual initiatives, securing resources to provide essential services and programs, acting as the administrative body for its citizenry, promoting health, education, and governance initiatives. The role of Métis citizens in governance is to establish, amend, and enforce the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan Constitution, to organize Métis citizens in their respective communities, and to participate in nation building in a good way. An overarching principle the MNS draws upon Métis historical practices based on the Buffalo Assembly that you spoke about, Daniel, and the laws of the prairies that were established by the community as a way of life. These communal laws and responsibilities ensured the survival of Métis people, especially during tough times. And one of the most recent tough times I think we've experienced is the pandemic. We were just talking about that before we started the session. An incredibly, really an experience that I think will hopefully never match in the future. So specifically, these principles are rooted in two important concepts: no individually centered way of thinking, and that strength was generated from the collective group. So two important principles. Among others were the foundation of the historic Métis culture. As such, the present-day Métis practices and principles honor the past and guide future nation building. And so I talked about the Provincial Métis Council, that these representatives are elected in the various 12 regions, including having representation from women and youth on that Provincial Métis Council, and that they also are part of the Métis Nation Legislative Assembly, where all of the local presidents are represented. And as I indicated, up to 112 locals are on our books, and they come together at least twice a year and talk about the issues and make decisions. And the unit and the area that I work for is exactly the PMC and the Legislative Assembly. And we're currently, and we have a constitution that is 30 years old, and I think one of the only, for many years, the only Métis Nation that has had a constitution that long. And so that constitution has really survived many legal challenges in Queen's Bench and others, and think elected leadership and citizens are very proud of that fact. And so the other part, it is 30 years old and has gone through one major revision in 2008, and now we are mandated to again go through a constitutional reform process. And I've been involved in that since I started with the nation in 2019. And so we are involved in on an annual basis, at least twice a year. We're out in communities in all the regions talking about the Constitution and what that is, that it is the highest law of the Métis Nation, Saskatchewan, and that, what do we want to do to make sure that it's current, it's relevant, and that it works for the citizens of Métis citizens here in Saskatchewan. So we've got a great team that we've been going around, and lot of great discussions, sometimes very heated, and we get into and really we're not there to debate with anyone, but lots of citizens out there are really forthright in their opinion about certain things, and that's a good thing, because you're passionate about what is important to you. And one of the things that we are hearing is for sure that this is their constitution, and that it is there to that they want it to work for them, and they want the government to follow their constitution. So, and I'll stop there. And I know there's another part of your question, Curtis, about partnerships.
Yeah, we can roll that into the next one.
All right.
Because you raised some interesting great points. Thank you, Dorothy. I appreciate, as I didn't mention this, but as a citizen myself, as a Michif person and a citizen of the Métis Nation, I appreciate your point that both the role of the citizenship registry, and that brought up our question for me that I'll save that for the Q&A, and the responsibilities that the citizens have, that we have to uphold the democratic tradition that you had said. We have a rich democratic tradition. And I love this saying, I think you probably heard it as well, both of you, that we like to vote so much that we vote on when we're going to vote. And also the passion that we have as well. I brought my 8-year-old daughter to one of the regional council meetings a couple of weeks ago, and she said, "Hey, Daddy, what side are you on?" And I said, "Oh, honey, no, we're just all passionate." So we have that tradition, and a wonderful kind of overview of how that lives on today. Thank you, Dorothy. And I did have that question about, some overview of the relationship that we have currently with the federal government and how that's kind of progressed recently. But let me just ask, because you did mention, we have there's other levels of government as well. So there's federal, there's provincial, there's municipal, there's private industry as well. And Daniel had mentioned that, you know, the current sort of partnership building that's happening across the homeland with all those certain areas, including even I can think of publicly funded institutions such as post-secondary institutions, universities, and researchers. And I guess my question is for you, Dorothy. Can you give us some examples of some what you see as successful partnerships and collaboration between Métis Nation, Saskatchewan government, and other levels of government in the Canadian state, or the private industry or universities that you think live up to this ideal that you had just spoken to?
Yes. Well, you know, before 2017, I don't think it's any secret that, you know, the Métis Nation in Saskatchewan had gone through many, many difficulties, many years of, you know, difficulty. And and a lot of good work has been done in that those difficult times, and setting up of institutions as well as others that, you know, continue to operate along those times. And I think the partnerships that we've begun to re-examine now is really the early stages, I think, of something more significant to come, where we are doing an example is MOUs. That's sort of our first step, and we do have one with USask dealing with citizenship and the verification of that through our registrar, and making sure that you know, in the times of the importance of authenticating Métis citizenship are important, and the identity that that we have. So that's one piece. But in addition to that MOU, though, there's also other opportunities to work on curriculum development, to work on training, to work on you know, other really critical things that I think the university really needs from the Métis Nation. And so that's one agreement, and that agreement has been in place now for 2 years. And we also have a training agreement with the provincial government that was signed last year, an MOU to do training, and just I think increasing the understanding of who Métis people are, and to, you know, have that more widespread, because there's certainly misunderstanding of who the Métis people are. And that where they fit in terms of you know, the say the Canadian mosaic, and so I think you know, that's something that we're really looking forward to doing that. And part of that is not just learning about the history, language, culture, etc. Is, I think there's a component in that that really needs to train everybody, me, others, everyone on this session today, is being trauma informed. And that you know, and that's one thing that I will highlight in terms of the work we do here at the Métis Nation, is that you know, we really have to be cognizant of the experience, the history that we've all gone through as Indigenous people and Métis people, First Nations people, that we carry that, and how we think, how we react, how we feel about interacting with people. And and how sometimes that gets expressed in different ways. So we have to really and I'll just highlight that for everyone, because I don't think we do that enough for ourselves and others to help them get a much better understanding of when you're learning about someone else's culture, or you're learning about more about who you are, your identity. So those are some of the things, and we've got other agreements I think we've signed with Next Gen and others, concerning duty to consult, and those that aspect of it, where we are asserting, and I'm not sure if that's a strong enough word, but that we need to be consulted. The Métis Nation needs to be consulted if there's any development or any time that Section 35 rights are going to be impacted. So, and I think our work is really just beginning. As I said, the MOU stages, I think, are really the initial first step for other kinds of collaborative work and partnerships that we can be part of as MNS here in Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Dorothy. And that's, again, a wonderful kind of overview of the great work that MNS has been doing in building those partnerships. But also, I love this point about moving past MOUs, right? Of course, MOUs are non-binding. They're kind of setting up a kind of like a vision for a relationship. And I totally appreciate that point, that moving past that is the key here. And I think, if I could, I'd like to move us from discussing a relation kind of in this one. We've just been talking, it's really about the relationship that Métis nations have with with Canada, with Canadians. And I think a lot of the times Indigenous folks, when we talk about it, which actually it's kind of centered on that relationship between an Indigenous group and Canada. But one of the things that I think that we appreciate as being important is the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with each other and in the distinct groups. And so if we could, I wonder if we can move to discuss a relationship that I think is not often kind of on the minds of a lot of folks, but I think is increasingly becoming much more important, and that's the relationship between First Nations and Métis. And I guess to begin this kind of sets of questions that I like to explore the kind of dynamics of the engagement process between the Métis and First Nations. A question for both you, Dorothy, and you as well, Daniel. I'd like to hear from both of you individually on why you think it is important, this relationship between Métis and First Nations. And if I could, I'd like to start with you, Daniel.
Sure, I love this question. This is actually the primary focus of my research, and so I think that this is exactly the right question to be asking. I have a very quick story to help illustrate why I think this matters, and it also gets us through, I think, the transition of thinking about Métis people's relationship with the state and orders of government, to thinking about Métis people's relationship to other Indigenous peoples. So before I went and did my PhD, I was a low-level spin doctor at the Manitoba legislature. I was in the Manitoba Legislative Internship Program. And just to give people a bit of a sense of what that program is like, most people hear internship and like, oh, you must have spent a lot of time making coffee and photocopying. That was the least. I did the least of that. The thing I did the most was doing research and briefing ministers and MLAs. And we had this great moment that crystallized for me why I needed to go back to school. The provincial government had released a program at the time. So this is around 2008-ish, kind of early 2007, 2008. And the provincial government at the time had released a program in which they were offering $25 million as an economic development fund for First Nations communities, primarily on reserve. There was very, very little money for off reserve, but primarily it was a $25 million on reserve economic development fund. Well, one of the members of the NDP caucus at the time was a guy named Greg Dewar. No relation to Gary. The doer is spelled differently. But like, and so Greg is a Métis guy, and I'd known him, and I got to work with him when I was an intern. I thought it was super cool. And he came to me. He was just like, $25 million for on-reserve communities? What are we doing for Métis communities? What are we doing for Métis people? Like, where's that money? And so we talked about it, and he was going to raise it with the cabinet, and he was going to kind of advocate for it in caucus. I never heard for sure what happened with that, but about like a month and a half later, there was a new press release that came out, and it was $250,000 in a Métis Economic Development Fund. And this to me was exactly the moment that I was like, I got to go back and study this thing. The reason why the relationship between Métis people and First Nations folks is so important is because there's always this third entity. Maybe it's the provincial government, maybe it's the federal government, maybe it's both of them, that takes actions that deliberately and sometimes unintentionally, they could be deliberate, could be unintentional, drive a wedge between us. Right? $25 million for on-reserve communities, which the provincial government had no jurisdiction over. That was an overreach on the provincial government's side. $250,000 for Métis people, which this was before the Daniels decision, which the province knew was their responsibility. Greg was furious. He was so furious. He said, what are they trying to do here? And it became clear to me that part of this is a wedge that gets driven between Indigenous communities. And so what I think is happening here is we have to be attentive as Indigenous peoples and political organizations for the way that we might be being pitted against each other for what are ultimately very small amounts of money. $25 million was a lot of money for economic fund. It's actually not a ton of money from the provincial government's perspective. $250,000, you find that in the couch, right? Public servants, this is great. Like you can find $250K in the couch and sometimes. So these divisions between us are often exacerbated by the way that the governments end up playing us off one another. And we have to be a lot more cognizant and strategic about recognizing and then also responding in ways that we don't then throw kerosene on this fire in our relationships with each other. So, I'm always great. It's always great to hear the way that Métis organizations and our governments are trying to work collaboratively with our on-reserve cousins. And we are often related as cousins. Like my uncle was shacked up on Broken Head First Nation with Rose Bear for the better part of his life. So we are in fact related to each other, but we can't keep throwing kerosene on these fires between us. That's one of the things that I think is the takeaway and what our task is as political actors in the Indigenous world.
Wonderful response. Thank you for that perspective from a great perspective on the relationship between a third party structure, process, and a relationship that goes way beyond that and way deeper than that. And Dorothy, from your perspective, I'd like to ask you the same question. Open-ended. Why do you think that this relationship is important?
Well, I think absolutely its importance is there because it is about Daniel's point. It is all about family. And that's where the connection is. Historically, that's how, the Métis emerged, is connecting with First Nations and, having families. And I mean, we are just doing some research right now on the role of Métis in historical treaty making. And I know and we're doing that right now. And I know our researcher is online here, Danette Starblanket, helping us with that. And but we know that Métis had a significant role throughout First Nations history, really, when it came to dealing with government, dealing with families. And so, I'll share a story as well in how important it is. And during the pandemic, the federal government really, they were able to deal with on-reserve residents for First Nations. They didn't know how to deal with off reserve. And because, there's a real issue with the federal government in dealing with, the moment you leave off the reserve, you sort of become a provincial responsibility. And so, we worked with the Meadow Lake Tribal Council in the Northwest region to help deliver some of the provisions that were being provided during the pandemic to off-reserve residents. So we were able to establish committees, that were both Métis and First Nations to do that. And that worked. And it was a really a solid partnership. But that worked only because we had family in those communities, in First Nations communities in the North. They're usually right side by side, the different communities, Métis communities and First Nations. So it worked from that perspective. In the North, that's kind of what is set up. That's the case in the northern communities. In the South, a little different. We sometimes collaborate on economic projects, that we go in partnerships with, maybe a consortium. We're part of consortiums for big projects because, the size of the project really requires more participation. So that for sure, it's going to be there, and I'll share another story of my family specifically. My family originate from Manitou Lake, which is near the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, and that's where my grandfather came. But of course, they came from the east, and eventually, my ancestors settled there, and maybe 100 years ago, they left that community. There's no one living there today, and there's another story to that, the reason why they left, but. The point I'm making is that my grandfather moved to Jackfish Lake and became part of Saulteaux First Nation. Others went to, Little Pine, Palmaker, Onion Lake, to Rocky Mountain House, to Rocky Boy in Montana, Great Falls, and to Alberta, northern Alberta. And some of my family, my cousins, live in one of the northern Métis settlements. They're part of that. So, it really is where you were in history, where and how family connected. So the significant tie is family, and that but we need to build on that. We need to build on that importance, because really we've done it, in terms of a livelihood. We've done it in terms of where we live, but we haven't done it yet on a political level. We haven't come together to work on, I shouldn't say that, because in 1982, we did come together then, but that's the only time that, really that we undertook to work together to make sure that the rights, Aboriginal rights and treaty rights were entrenched in the Canadian Constitution when it was brought home from Britain. So that and the significance and the impact of that is huge. Imagine if we can begin to work together even in Saskatchewan, and I can just talk about Saskatchewan, the impact we would have on a political level if we were to do that. And I think that is a challenge for all of us to think about how that can begin to work for us, and how we can bring, I think we talk about these partnerships, how much more significant, how much more in terms of sitting across the table negotiating on certain things, how much more the power that comes with that. I think I can't begin to even think all of what that would bring.
Such a yes, it's such a wonderful point, and I think it can be understated, that importance and the power of that, and I think, and this also goes back to the fact, what are the conditions that might have been challenging that, or not allowing that to happen? As Daniel said, I think you mentioned kerosene and also driving a wedge right between us, and I think, and there's a condition when the fact that there's not a hierarchy of rights in the Canadian Constitution between the three groups. So it's incumbent upon us as Indigenous folk to be able to develop those nation-to-nation relationships. As you say, Dorothy, will lead to a very powerful situation, and I think benefit for everybody. And I'm thinking recently we've heard in the news about some, when the importance of this relationship between First Nations and Métis, it can lead sometimes to be controversial, or there's some disputes when this relationship is not taken care of. And I'm thinking in particular of a recent controversy that's happened arose in Ontario with the chiefs there of Ontario, in response to concerns that they've had about the Métis Nation of Ontario Self-Government Implementation Act, and how that was brought into the Bill C-53, which is currently in Parliament now. And I think this speaks to the importance of this mutually important relationship. And I guess to me, Dorothy, you raised the importance of this. Daniel, you spoke about the challenges to this. And I guess my question to you, Daniel, is, given that there's this historical context and kinship ties between Métis and First Nations, but there's also this broader governance structure, the processes and structures that are not of our making, but that somehow can intervene in that. My question to you, Daniel, is simply, in the context of interindigenous relations, what are some of the ways that you see First Nations and Métis communities be able to navigate this complex legal and historical relationship to build this prosperity and for mutual recognition that Dorothy is alluding to as well? Yeah.
Yeah, and Dorothy's got it right. I think the component of being able to see ourselves, there's a weird thing in the Métis Nation is, and this was true in my family too, we struggle sometimes to see ourselves in other nations, but we're there, right? We have relationships that tie us, kinship relationships that tie us to other Indigenous peoples in the region. That's not unusual. The thing is that we tend not to see it. There can be a bit of a hyper nationalism among, I think, Métis people that gets in our way of collaboration. But that's also true for First Nations communities too. I think we actually both struggle to see each other in our own histories, in our family trees, and in our opportunities for political coordination, if I can phrase it that way. So there's a couple of things that I think are helpful. One is, I'm a big fan of education. I think that we need to be encouraging Métis and First Nations folks to be in the same rooms together in higher education and universities, and potentially in band schools. I think that there's room for that as well. I think also that I think there's a need to encourage people to this is controversial. There's a bit of a tendency in the way that Métis people talk about our struggles that we want to emphasize our dispossession and our struggle and our suffering and the violence that's been impacted on our communities. And that's real. There's also the same desire among First Nations communities to do the same thing. When we get in the same room, I sometimes am concerned that there becomes a little bit of a desire to quantify and hierarchize that suffering and that political struggle. And so there's a desire for one people to have more of a struggle than the other. The reality is that's not super helpful. In part because of the nature of our legal distinctions, our suffering and our struggles, our political struggles, have been different. And so it's not really possible to kind of say, well, one has been worse than the other. So there is I want to encourage, and I'm working on this as part of a book project, and this is the sort of the end chapter that I've been trying to hammer out, is we need to encourage all Indigenous peoples to let go of this desire for our struggle to have been worse than other people's struggles. We've got to let go of that. It's not helpful. And I remember, actually, this is a great Saskatchewan story. Howard Adams, some of the people in the room might recognize that name, Métis activist, taught at the University of Saskatchewan and at Regina for many years. He said one of the great colonial problems that we face is the creation of the view of colonialism by the colonized as local elements of the struggle. That all of the things you're facing are being framed as being localized, that we're not able to see each other in each other's struggles. And that's, I think, also partly what's at play is really particularizing how we think about the things that we have been through and the things that we want to achieve. Those two things end up getting very small if we only think of them through the lenses of our own experiences. And those experiences are important, and that's part of the story, but we can't over rely on that. We have to start seeing each other together. The other thing I always want to acknowledge is we have to understand the differences in that the nature of our legal identities have been around for a really long time. Status Indians care about being status Indians. We have pretty clear senses of that literature is quite firm. We understand that there's an identity that's tied to being a status Indian. Métis people also are now quite tied to our own absence of being status Indians, right? That is also a key component of how we think of ourselves. One of the things I want to encourage is that if you're in a room, don't try to maximize those divisions. They're already really entrenched. We have to kind of be thoughtful and strategic about how we overcome those divisions, again, to be able to see each other, see ourselves in each other. And so I think it's complicated, but it's not impossible.
Thank you, Dan. I think you raised some really important points there that are really, I think, especially on the individual level, on how we go about as Indigenous folks in these rooms. Switching to Dorothy and kind of bringing back to the Saskatchewan context and to a governance perspective as well, because we have obviously a lot of civil servants here, public servants in the room. And you had mentioned before, you gave an example of some of the things that Métis Nation Saskatchewan has done to work effectively and build partnerships and collaborations with First Nations. And I know that there's some other examples out there. I think working with COVID, Northern security, issues around, I remember, I think it was Cumberland House First Nation and Métis Nation Saskatchewan share a sign that says that you're entering this shared territory. And I think there's a lot of work that Métis Nation Saskatchewan has been doing internally to set up processes for these effective engagements. My question to you is, what makes these engagements effective? What is the thing that's underneath them that allows this sort of joining between these, two political or institutional representations of these peoples to work effectively? And I guess, an additional question to that is, how can public servants from the provincial government learn from that?
Well, I think that one of the things that MNS has really focused on is maintaining the relationship. And when you maintain a relationship, you're not just there when you want something from the other party, from the other nation, that you're there, you're at events, you're going to, suppers or breakfasts with your neighbors. It's at a human level. That's what has been going on, particularly, and again, the communities that we've been involved with. We often, and our president is really excellent at really just socializing, going places, and if he's at a hockey tournament, he'll find a reason to go and talk to people and shake hands around. I guess as a politician, but also as a leader of MNS. He's just excellent at doing that. And it doesn't matter where he is, he'll go and talk to somebody and start a conversation. So maintaining those relationships is important, and learning about that, and I spoke about that earlier, is go and learn about the people you want to start a working relationship with. If you don't do that, and you're going to have all kinds of mishaps and in working with our Métis communities. And respecting leadership, that you are dealing with a nation, and it has to be done at that level. You cannot, go directly to a local, and that because then you've misstepped again. If you don't go to the president, the executive that represent the Métis Nation, and it's really just about protocol, understanding that and being able to, say, hey, I do want to work with you. I do want to do this, and give yourself lots of time. Don't come to the Métis Nation and say, oh, I have a project I want, and I want to finish it in 12 months. That's not enough time. So be there for, think ahead. It's just equally important. If let's say you're wanting some kind of development, equally important to line up your financing, equally important to come and talk to the Métis Nation if you're in their territory. And really, in Saskatchewan, you're going to either be in First Nations territory or in Métis territory, no matter where you go. And so knowing that, and also that recognition of Section 35 rights, that's a given, and that the Métis people have rights. They're rights holders. And you can't, no matter what you do in Canada, that's a fact, that's the law today. And so it's in the Canadian Constitution. So if I were to give advice to policymakers, this is those are important points. Is the respect, the protocol, and don't bypass. Do good planning, learn, and maintain those relationships, because if and really other levels of governments have to, what's going on, think ahead, plan ahead. If you're going to do something on a short-term basis, for something that's long-term, it's not going to work. And think about it like, if in your own backyard, someone comes in and wants to dig up something in your backyard, and they only come and ask you the day they're going to dig. you're not going to say that you're not going to welcome them. You're going to say absolutely not. So it's really there's no magic to it. It's pretty basic, dealing with people on a human level, but also knowing that these are nations, and that they carry certain rights, and that you can't bypass.
Thank you, Dorothy. Wonderful points. And treat it as a relationship and understand how the governance system enough to be able to know how to engage with it properly. Very good, very good. Daniel, quickly to you. Do you have anything that you wish to add about, what you would tell a public servant on how to effectively support and create a good engagement and interactions with Métis communities and governments?
Just really quick, Dorothy, I think, hit the nail on the head. I think probably one of the things that I think is helpful for civil servants is to also appreciate their position in this, in the work that you folks are doing. There's a desire sometimes to forget that, and I say this because I worked for a while doing some of the similar sort of stuff, but inside the legislature. There's sometimes I forgot that I was sort of an agent of the crown in a particular fashion, or after a particular fashion. What I mean by that is that when I went somewhere, I wasn't just going as, Daniel Voth, just the schmo. Like, people knew that I was working, where I was working and who I was talking to and that sort of thing. So I think that there is, a self-awareness that I always want to encourage for folks when they're interacting with indigenous communities. It's not the same, as Dorothy's pointed out, there's a particular type of political relationship that we're trying to cultivate to improve relations between provincial, federal governments and indigenous governments and political organizations. So I think that might be helpful, just as one little thing, is to think about, okay, who am I in this meeting? That actually might be the great question to ask yourself, half an hour before you go in. Okay, I am this person in this meeting, and I'm not really who I am when I'm at home or I'm at the grocery store, and that you can kind of more appreciate the role that you have to play in these interactions with indigenous communities. But so that's more of the mindset. All of the practical stuff that Dorothy said is aces. That's absolutely perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, Daniel, Dorothy. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one more point I forgot to mention in that, is mentorship. Look for opportunities to mentor Métis people in your systems. Creating safe spaces for Indigenous employees is really, really important. And it's a huge challenge even today in the provincial government and federal, because we're the minority always, and you are under a lot of scrutiny. You don't come from the same background. You don't, you really need to think about how we can mentor Métis people into helping you create really relevancy in policy development and implementation, because they're the ones that actually have the knowledge, and you need to mentor them to help you do the work that would truly have relevant policy development and legislative development.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you, Daniel, for your very thoughtful answers. I think that's a great opportunity and great place for us to stop and move on to the Q&A. So we'll wrap up our panel discussion there. So again, thank you. And I'd like to take the time now to open the floor to any questions. I think this has been a great opportunity to delve deeper into those issues. But I've been looking at the chat here, and I see some wonderful questions. I think a lot of these make a lot of sense for some folks here. Karen's passed on a question for me, and the first one will go, and I'll leave it up to you folks to determine who wants to answer these questions here. And this question is, how do we know which are legitimate Métis organizations, governments, etc.?
I think, can I jump on that one?
Yep.
Well, I think it's pretty easy, and I say that just because I work in the with the different nations. I think going to Métis National Council's website, you'll know who the governing members are and the governing members are are listed there on their website, and from there you can track that on a provincial level from Ontario westward. So I think that way, and I mean there are Métis nations in each Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC. But there are also Aboriginal organizations as well. So if you're looking for Métis, I think that would be I would just recommend that as the best source.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, anything to add?
Very quickly. I love this question because it's where the rubber hits the road for you folks. So you've got a program, you want to do consultation, you might actually feel like you've got legal duty to consult. Who do you talk to? And I think the top line from Dorothy is correct, is you will always do well starting with speaking with the large Métis government, so Manitoba Métis Federation, if you're in Manitoba, the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. There is something else I'd like to just let you think a little bit about. There's also a large number of non-traditional Métis organizations that do interesting work. That this gets a bit complicated for you folks on answering who do you talk to, but there is value in doing a little bit of work collaboratively with those governments to see if there are other voices that you might also want to hear from. So for example, for a long time in Manitoba, there was a Two-Spirit Métis political or a Métis local that just recently in the last few years has sort of been incorporated into the Manitoba Métis Federation, but for a long time it wasn't. And for some of these political organizations, and they're Métis people, but they're deliberately outside some of those political organizations. And I think it is valuable to think about, how do we as civil servants hear a wide variety of perspectives? And so I think that there is a little bit of careful collaboration that I think I'd encourage to try and figure out how you can hear from those folks too, who might deliberately be choosing to organize outside of those spaces, because you might actually hear interesting things, but you do then heighten your risk of talking to the wrong people. So the top line is correct, but thinking about how you manage that risk is also a very interesting question, and that can be collaboratively. And it also can be a real payoff in terms of wow, we heard some things that we hadn't heard before. And that's enriching our ability to advise, to build policy, to build regulation. So maybe I'll throw that in there too.
Yeah.
Great point, Daniel. And I think we can think of it almost as like civil society organizations, right? In the Métis world, right? And I think also for civil servants, it's important to kind of understand that given the fact that Métis people were, as we say, constitutional football, there was a rise during this time where we weren't a federal, quote, responsibility, that there was a rise of third-party organizations that needed to come and fill that gap to providing services. And right now we're in a transition period where there's this recognition of our governments that are democratically elected, et cetera. So you're right. I think that's a great point, is that when we're thinking about engaging with, and this is to Dorothy's point, engaging with Métis people, you need to go to their democratically elected governments to which they, are represented as rights holders, essentially. So this is great. We have another question here from Asol. Asol asks, Dorothy has touched upon Section 35 and the duty to consult. Could Dorothy please expand on what the concrete measures that would fulfill that duty to consult in her view?
Okay. Before I move to that question, I just wanted to do a supplementary on what Daniel spoke about. In Saskatchewan, we also have, as I indicated in when I was describing MNS and structure, we do have a Métis women's group, La Fille de Madeleine, that represents Métis women in Saskatchewan, and they're the ones that pick the representation in the regions as well as in at the assembly and at the provincial Métis Council. So, and we also have youth as well that are represented there. So they're similarly represented, and so those are other groups that, depending on what it is that you're asking about, you may want to include them as well. So on the duty to consult, well, that part, what is, I guess, as MNS, who represents the interest of Métis citizens in Saskatchewan, that would be your first stop, is to come and see the political representatives of the Métis Nation, and not bypass them to go to the locals or the communities. So that's the process. And so that we ensure that if there are any impacts on Section 35 rights, that we have the expertise, that the legal expertise in our government to be able to monitor that. And we do have a department as well that handles duty to consult processes as well. And we have, I think, a book that, that our communities can access. So that's the process that we use, and that office, that department has hundreds and hundreds of inquiries that come in to their office to, something to small sort of impacts that aren't really impacting Section 35 to actual ones that do. So that's the process that I would recommend that happens. So the steps to be taken.
Thank you, Dorothy. This is from Julia. Julia asks, and it kind of aligns, I think, maybe to the answer you've given, but maybe specifically the challenges. And she asks, what are some of the main challenges faced by Métis today, and how can external organizations support their goals?
Do you want me to take a swing? Take a swing at
Sure.
that?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So there's a couple of things that I think that we can think about as opportunities. I sometimes frame them as opportunities for growth. I think that there's room for us to reimagine the way we think about land-based living and land-based education. I think that there's a space for government to be a partner in this. One of the core, in responding to what has been a core claim of Métis people since 1870, which is we have not received and did not receive a land base for us to engage in the types of activities that are really important for us. And I think that there's a role for government to play in imagining how we can address that, and how that can be reimagined in a way that gives Métis people communities to live in, but also opportunities for us to think about how we teach the next generation those really important questions about like the debates about what it looks like to live a good life. I think that there is a role there for government to be a partner in this. And I want to just, interestingly, in Alberta, I had to learn this when I moved here. The Métis settlements was a provincial response. So that is a land base created by the provincial government for Métis people, and it emerges out of this weird sort of context in the 30s and 40s. But there's an opportunity for us to for provinces to be laboratories of the federation. That's the way we talk about it in federalism literature, laboratories of the federation. Let's not forget that provinces have the ability to innovate. You don't, and having advised, there's this desire to always want to say, this is how this lines up with every other province. And if we do this differently, we'll be an outlier. Sometimes being an outlier is exactly what you want, right? So don't give up that opportunity for you to be creative and to think differently about some of these questions, particularly around a Métis land base. I'll leave it there, and Dorothy will have other good stuff.
Well, absolutely. We in Saskatchewan, MNS government has no land. We're not a land-based government, and we want to change that, of course. And so we're doing it a number of ways. One, we have a land claim in the Northwest that it's been 30 years in the process. And also in our self-government agreement, we have land claims as one of the things that we want on the table, and in fact has been set up as a table to further negotiate and discuss and advance that those claims, and hopefully we don't have to stay in the court system to resolve those issues because they're very costly for the Métis Nation. So, and it would include, of course, not only the current land claim, but also advancing other claims. Green Lake is one that we're working on as well, and but it also would include, farms. I mean, there were Métis farms in Saskatchewan, and having some, exploring how we can begin settling those. So it's just really beginning, and really it's for many of not just Saskatchewan but BC as well, and Ontario. These land bases are really, and the right to land is a really a big priority for all of those governing members, and making sure that we get there eventually to have a land base, I think is something that's really a priority for us.
Thank you, both of you. So I think we'll probably have time for one more. There's a lot of wonderful questions in the chat here, and I'm going to kind of try to jam a bunch of them together, and because I think it adds nicely to, I think Daniel, you had said about innovation and provinces as being kind of labs of innovation for federalism. Excuse me. And I think about the fact that the Canadian federal government in its negotiations with the Métis required Métis to be able to define who its people are, right? As kind of a precondition for negotiations, you need to know who you're negotiating with, and that makes sense. So they set up the Powley Initiative to fund registries, the creation of a standardized registry across the homeland. And yet the federal government does not use that same Powley initiative and registries in its own, say, employment and hiring Métis people. into their governments. They don't require Métis people yet, I think, is my knowledge, to present verification based on their citizenship. Yet the University of Saskatchewan and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan signed a agreement that recognizes the registry and its authority in determining who Métis people are. So my question is to Dorothy, but Daniel, feel free to chime in. Is why is a citizenship agreement like this important? And what would you say in terms of the provincial government or federal governments adopting something similar?
Well, it really became an issue, I think, in the last 18 to 24 months, when when we had people that were claiming to be Métis were not in fact Métis, but yet were able to get benefits that really being a Métis in terms of work, employment, all of those things. So I think it was really in with that in mind why USask negotiated this MOU with MNS to verify Métis citizenship of potential, in hiring and in scholarships and in a number of areas that the university was involved in. So that was an important one, and really, I think that from the Métis perspective and the nation itself, these programs and maybe designated positions for faculty, etc., were really intended to benefit Métis people, and to acknowledge, I think, the systemic barriers that are often in place, whether they're intentional or not. But for that reason, that this agreement was signed, and I think that I mean. And I'll give you an example of First Nations University of Canada. I was involved in 1976 when that federated agreement was being negotiated, where the elders said, and leaders said, we want our people to be educated and have the same access to education that is available for all Canadians, and that we want to be able to have our people trained so that we can have them come home and help us with programming, the policy, the all the expertise that's needed to run our governments, and to continue educating our people. And so that was the reason that they went to University of Regina to do that. And of course, just the setup of that institution has made a huge difference in terms of the numbers of Indigenous students being educated. But not only did they want access to education, but they wanted it relevant. They wanted it to go and learn about the language, the culture, all of those things, not just for the First Nations University, but to be accessible to the rest of other students that were attending that university. So that thinking about that and the benefits to that, those are open. The university is open, but there are things like education, faculty positions, etc., that are sometimes earmarked for Métis or other Indigenous individuals to be part of that, simply because of the inequities of the past, and to make sure that they have that opportunity to get the foot in the door, and that are people that are qualified, that the same as any other at the university. So I think that was the one reason that we agreed to sitting at the table with the university to say this was what was needed, and this is what is required, and this is how we'll do that to verify citizenry of potential candidates or for employment or for scholarship bursaries or research for that matter.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you. And thank you, Daniel. So now, since I'm looking at the clock here, we're nearing the end of our time here. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank both of you, Daniel and Dorothy, for your very thoughtful, wonderful answers and your generosity in spending time with us today. For everyone else, if you enjoyed this lecture, please keep an eye out for the JSGS events calendar for upcoming events and program information sessions as well. And Karen will be sharing this information in the chat. Please, though, join me in a round of applause using emojis in whatever fashion you can assemble to thank our two wonderful participants today. Thank you both. And everyone else, thank you again for joining us. It was wonderful having you, and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.